Hey guys, I'm a creep. I'm a weirdo. I don't belong here. That's what the South Vietnamese people wished Ngo Dinh Diem had said before he plunged the country into chaos by initiating raids on Buddhist pagodas. This very same decision would eventually lead to his death. But how did we get here? What made the Vietnamese people so angry with him that they would kill him if they had elected him as president only 8 years prior? Let's go back to a budding South Vietnam in 1955 and introduce a few key players. Following a war for independence from France, Vietnam split into a communist north led largely by Ho Chi Minh and a French-backed south led by former Emperor Bao Dai. The two countries were highly at odds and barely even recognized that the other was a real country. In South Vietnam, a relatively young politician by the name of Ngo Dinh Diem was scheming. Diem was the prime minister of South Vietnam, but held only a little bit of power and wanted more. He had been appointed to the position by former Emperor Bao Dai as a way to ensure American aid. Bao Dai did not like Diem at all. However, it would seem that Diem was a competent politician because by mid-1955 he had taken care of all of the smaller rebel and private army groups roaming around South Vietnam. He had also managed to keep South Vietnam's economy relatively stable throughout the 1954 economic crisis that had happened. So he decided now was the time to get rid of Bao Dai once and for all. Diem called for a referendum on whether the state of South Vietnam should become a republic or remain a monarchy. In an astonishing voter turnout of 108.42% of registered voters, Diem established the Republic of Vietnam and declared himself its president. To be entirely clear, this was an incredibly rigged election. Campaigning for Bao Dai, the emperor, was strictly forbidden, and the government pumped out pornographic anti-Bao Dai ads. Diem had his brother, Ngo Dinh Nhu, rig the elections beyond any semblance of feasibility. In the words of Jessica Chapman in Staging Democracy, South Vietnam's 1955 referendum to depose Bao Dai on the 23rd of October 1955, South Vietnam citizens took to the polls to choose between the country's obsolete emperor and its far from popular Prime Minister Ngo Dinh Diem. Thus began the short and sordid reign of Ngo Dinh Diem as dictator in all but name of South Vietnam. After Diem's landslide victory in his fraudulent election, he got right to work. He promoted those who were Christian or his friends to offices of power, even if they weren't qualified.
Hi. It's been a while. It's been over 20 years since I've met you. You have been a really great um officer in my community for so long, and I can't wait to surprise you. Here you go. It's a giant pizza just for you for your 20 years of service in this government. Now, I'm see ya. Oh, so you're the new guy. It's been so long. I can't wait to meet you. We kicked out a guy just for you. You know what? You, I only met you like a week ago in a bar. Remember that? Remember that? Yeah. But you, a Christian, have so much potential in our circle. I cannot wait to hire you. You're already hired as a secretary.
Eventually, few people began noticing Diem's questionable practices and got kind of angry about it. People started questioning, why do we have to listen to him? Why is he in charge? And it even started to trickle into the military. Eventually, in 1960, only 5 years after he had been elected, tensions boiled over and the paratrooper division of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN for short, revolted. They marched into Saigon and took Diem captive, but their plan had a few flaws. The first and foremost being, they hadn't sealed off the city, so DM loyal reinforcements could march in at any time. Eventually, this proved to be exactly the case after DM stalled with the promises of negotiation. The 5th and 7th Division of the ARVN marched into Saigon virtually unopposed and fought and eventually beat the paratroopers. However, this was just the beginning of DM's troubles with his increasingly disillusioned people and military. One of the main problems people had with DM's regime was actually not with DM himself. By far the most unpopular person in South Vietnam at the time were a married couple. Their names were Ngo Dinh Nhu and his wife, usually referred to as Madam Nhu. New was usually regarded as the brains of the operation, masterminding most of the political moves his brother would make. He was incredibly unpopular for the way he made the government increasingly dictatorial every single day, and for the obvious bias towards Christians and loyalty over skill when promoting. Even more hated was his wife, Madame Nu. She was known by some as the Dragon Lady, but as dragons were considered good luck in Vietnam, she was known as the Tiger Lady there. She had a fiery attitude and would often physically and verbally abuse Diem and Nu. Wesley Fishel, an anti communist academic from Michigan State University, described her in this way. His wife is as brilliant, vivacious, bitchy, and brutal in her Borgia like fashion as ever. And with, charitably, the purest of intentions, she is succeeding in alienating substantial segments of the population from her brother in law's regime at a time when it needs the enthusiastic support of everyone. Madame Nu was everything Vietnam did not need: conceited, rude, fiery, headstrong, and extremely classicist. As the popularity of the government declined, unrest proliferated and groups began to plot against Diem Nu and Madame Nu. One of the earliest real attempts at assassinating the group was carried out by two Vietnamese Air Force officers. The two Air Force officers stole two planes and commenced a bombing run on the presidential palace. One bomb landed directly next to Diem, who was reading a biography of George Washington at the time, but it failed to detonate.
Trenton, yup. He's better than the other guy. Yup. George Washington. Oh, he's gonna become president. President. Huh. It's interesting. Oh my god. Oh wait, that's just a bomb. 500 kilogram bomb on my hands. Right next to me. Whatever.
In a radio announcement after the attack, Diem claimed he had divine protection. All people in the New family escaped unharmed, except for Madame Nu, who sustained minor injuries. Still, this set the tone for the South Vietnamese people and even the South Vietnamese military to take action against their dictatorial and cruel government. As time dragged on, more and more people became discontent. One of them was Tran Kim Thuyen. Thuyen, an advisor to Diem, began to be disillusioned with the No brothers after much of his former power had been transferred to the other RVN security agencies. He needed to secure the ARVN to make any real attempts at a coup, but he never did, and eventually all of his followers fell in with other, larger plots. The plot they fell in with was led by a man named Pham Ngoc Thao, who was actually, although it was revealed much later, a communist sleeper agent. In Misalliance, Miller says, quote, "Uncertainty about his real agenda persists even today." Close quote. He plotted against Diem in 1963 and merged plots with Thuyen. However, neither of them had what they really needed: the ARVN generals on their side. The final plot had all of this and more. This was a serious plot, one that actually had a shot of overthrowing Diem. This plot was, quote, composed exclusively of military officers, close quote. The three officers in charge were Generals Don, Big Min, and Kim. General Don was actually one of Diem's trusted Catholic inner circle, but when Diem feared he may become a powerful rival, he confined him to an office with no troops and stripped him of nearly all of his power. Don began organizing other officers who were thinking of a coup and established a link with Lucien Conen, a CIA agent. Big Min was in a similar boat. After a sound defeat of a crime syndicate in Saigon, he was viewed as a hero by the people and a threat by Diem. Diem subsequently demoted him to a powerless position. General Kim suffered the humiliation of being investigated and subsequently demoted to a position of no power after the paratroopers' revolt of 1960. Together, these three generals plotted against Diem and his entourage. These three alone were not enough to overthrow Diem, though. They needed the support of a fourth general whose troops were stationed in and around Saigon, the capital where Diem stayed. If they could get this fourth general on board, they would have all the troops they needed. The general in charge of the troops in Saigon was a general who was reckless and famous for partying and alcohol. His name was Ton That Din. This conspiracy would wax and wane according to Din's whims. The three generals had only managed to secure his support by stroking his ego. Now one of the coups had a real military force and the people's support, but they were missing one crucial thing: U.S. backing. If they deposed the U.S.-backed President Diem without the U.S.'s permission, it is probable the copious amounts of aid flowing into the country would stop. This would heavily hamper the war effort against the Viet Cong. So, to get the U.S. backing they needed, General Don approached a CIA operative, Lucien Conan, at a 4th of July party. Don told Conan that he was involved in a coup plot and wanted to know, quote, what will the American reaction be if we go all the way? Close quote. Conan, Conan didn't have an answer yet. For the next few weeks, the U.S. would waffle back and forth and never give a clear answer. Some, like Roger Hilsman, who had apparently long disliked the leadership in South Vietnam, had been suggesting regime change since May 1963. Others did not want to overthrow Diem and thought that the regime could still be saved. While the U.S. was going back and forth, big things were happening in South Vietnam. In the background of everything, discontent had been growing among the Buddhist majority of the country. Diem had always favored Christians in his government, which was cause enough for unrest. But he'd stepped over the line when, on the anniversary of the 1000th year of Buddhism in Vietnam, he had banned the flying of the Buddhist flag. This outraged the Buddhists all over South Vietnam, and many began protesting. Diem did nothing and further alienated his people. With the people and the generals of his own army now angry at him or actively plotting against him, Diem had to do something. But it wasn't Diem who took action, it was his brother Nu. Nu had been calling the shots on some pretty major issues so far, and he decided to get out of this problem with some pretty crazy trickery. Only 3 days after Don met with the CIA operative Lucien Conan, Nu called a pretty routine lunch meeting with the generals. Miller says, quote, officers were used to hearing Nu lecture them on the finer points of personalism and strategic Hamlets. Close quote. That wasn't what was on his mind today. Instead, Nu suggested a coup against his own brother. When the officers asked him, what happened? Why do you hate your brother now? He simply responded that he and Diem had had a falling out. He told the generals that they should launch a lightning-fast coup in the dead of the night before a new U.S. ambassador, Henry Cabot Lodge, arrived. The generals were stunned. Why would someone suggest a coup against their own regime, let alone their own brother? Nu had two reasons. One, he said, later, was to get inside their heads. He explained it was a kind of psychoanalytic procedure. He wanted to get in their heads and do more than just scare them. He did get in their heads a little bit, but they decided to take his advice. They decided that they would declare martial law on the night of August 20th to 21st and then proceed with a coup later on, like Nu recommended. But they were all of them deceived, for another plot was made. In the land of South Vietnam, in the fires of the royal palace, the Dark Lord Nu forged in secret a master plot to control all others. And into this plot he poured all his cruelty, his malice, and his will to dominate all life. One plot to rule them all. Hold on, sorry. Carried away there. Anyway, it was true. Nu hatched another plot to get rid of the generals and cement his and his brother's power all at once. He had the idea of mobilizing probably the most powerful force in South Vietnam, Buddhist majority. They were riled up after the harrowing and poignant self-immolation of Buddhist priest Thich Quang Duc, who burned himself alive to protest the Diem regime's treatment of Buddhists. Several monks after him took after his example and did the same. His self-immolation had a extreme effect on the media at the time. All over the world, people saw the photo of him burning in the busy streets of Saigon and were touched and horrified at the Diem regime's treatment of Buddhists. The people were sufficiently angry for Nu. How would he get all of those people to hate the generals in so little time? Nu had an idea. Nu knew that the generals were planning to establish a new order without Nu by declaring martial law, and he knew the time. Nu knew new knowledge, and he was going to use it, so he cleverly decided to launch raids all across South Vietnam on Buddhist pagodas. At the same time, the generals declared martial law. So it would seem to all the people that the generals had declared martial law simply to raid the Buddhist pagodas. But Nu didn't want the people to simply infer that the generals had done it. He wanted there to be no doubt in their minds. So Nu put out lots of propaganda blaming the generals. Government-controlled newspapers described the occupation of the pagodas as the work of, quote, the army with the help of the police, close quote. The generals were dumbstruck and extremely angry. They had fallen right into news trap. The entire world was outraged at the pagoda raids, and all the fingers seemed to be pointing at these three generals as the ringleaders. They denied all these accusations vehemently to anyone who asked them. They were furious, and their resolve to depose New and Diem had never been stronger. In order to ensure their security and continuing stability, the Diem regime would be reorganized into the first. Sorry, a little off track there. Anyway, the generals were really mad and they really wanted to act on it. They needed one thing still. They needed US backing. The United States had been waffling for months and months and hadn't given any clear answer. After the raids on Buddhist pagodas, Roger Hilsman and fellow Soft Hawk, people who were advocating for deposing Diem, Michael Forrestal drafted a hasty cable to Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge, who had arrived just 2 days prior. The cable was given the go-ahead in one of the most careless ways for such a vital matter. Most of the presidential cabinet was on vacation during the drafting of this cable, Cable 243, as this cable was going to be called. They called Kennedy to get approval, but he told them to wait till Monday. Hilsman and Forrestal told Kennedy they wanted to get it done quick. So Kennedy told them to go get another high-ranking official to get it cleared. He put an entire coup on the line of what is equivalent to me as a go ask your mom, and if she says yes, then I say yes. Hilsman and Forrestal then went to Undersecretary of State George Ball, who told them to wait until after his round of golf. After he read the message, he passed off the baton of responsibility to Undersecretary of State Dean Rusk. Dean Rusk finally gave them a green light to go ahead, so they went back to Kennedy. Kennedy said he would endorse it if Rusk and the stand-in for Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, Roswell Joe Patrick, approved. So Hilsman and Forrestal called Joe Patrick and asked him what he thought. He gave the go-ahead, later saying, quote, if Rusk went along with it and the president went along with it, I wasn't going to oppose it, close quote. He didn't even show it to McNamara. The same thing happened to Chairman Joint Chiefs of Staff General Maxwell Taylor. His Marine General, Victor Krulak, also signed off on the cable without showing him. The same thing happened to the CIA Director John McCone. After this, Kennedy gave the go-ahead to send its cable. If this whole thing sounded incredibly complex, with an almost cartoonish running back and forth between officials, it's because it was. The whole thing was handled so clumsily, awkwardly, and ineptly, it is laughable. The whole fate of a nation was hanging on this cable, and three department heads weren't even notified it existed before someone had signed it for them. The cable stated, U.S. government cannot tolerate situation in which power lies in New's hands. Diem must be given chance to rid himself of New and his coterie and replace them with the best military and political personalities available. The US government was hoping maybe Diem would see how negatively New, and especially Madame New, was affecting him. He hadn't really given any thought to who would replace him, so keeping him seemed like an easy solution. Either way, the telegram was sent, and the message was relayed to the generals by Lodge. When the American presidential cabinet next convened, several members were furious. Many felt they had been tricked, and many had not been informed of it at all. But they didn't rescind the cable, meaning the US still considered, despite misgivings about who would lead next, that trying to forcefully separate Diem and the news was their only option. The generals were furious and seemed on the verge of a coup. Actions by New bought the Diem regime a little more time to consolidate their power. A few days after the coup fell apart, Kennedy sat for an interview, and when asked if Diem could still fix the mess he made, he said, quote, I do. With changes in policy and perhaps with personnel, I think it can. Close quote. Followed up that sentence with a near threat. Quote, if it doesn't make those changes, I would think the chances of winning it would not be very good. Close quote. Nearly 2 months after the original August coup plans, on October 5th, Big Min asked the United States if it would be open to a coup. The U.S. responded by saying they did not want to stimulate a coup, but they wouldn't be against one either. Lodge encouraged the generals to organize a coup and work for it, but it remained largely a solely Vietnamese affair. A month went by, and after trying to convince the young and brash General Dinh, To support their coup, the plotters finally began their plot during a lunch on September the 1st of 1963. The Americans had no idea this was happening and even had an ambassador in Diem's office just 2 hours before the coup was scheduled to occur. Either way, Big Min led the group of generals and they stormed the royal palace. Diem was nowhere to be found. Neither was Nu. They had escaped to a safe house in Chalon, a neighborhood of Saigon. From there, they had a wire that they used to speak to the generals directly outside of the royal palace. After the rebels stormed the palace, the rebels and the No brothers came to an agreement. The brothers would surrender, and in return, they would be granted safe exile. They were subsequently arrested after they turned themselves in, and on their way to a transport plane, they were murdered. All right, sir. Now that you've given yourself up, we promise you a safe exile. Let's go. Most assume, and it's the general consensus, that it was on the orders of Big Min, and their bodies were dumped unceremoniously on the side of the road next to some railroad tracks. Madame Nu, one of the prime instigators of this whole thing, was in Paris at the time and would live until 2011. The generals attempted to cover up their murder of the brothers by suggesting they had committed suicide, but when photos of the bodies surfaced, these claims were refuted. Big Min took over South Vietnam and would be deposed only 3 months later. The dictator after that, a man named Khan, lasted only a year. After that, a man named Van Thieu took the reins of an unstable and failing South Vietnam before it fell to the communists in 1975. When the US backed the coup to overthrow Diem, they didn't know who would take his place. That was their number one mistake. An overthrow of Diem and replacement with a more viable leader was possible. The US never looked for one. Despite realizing that it would be a problem early on, the US did nothing about it and led to the eventual loss in the Vietnam War and fall of South Vietnam. There was no good foresight into what the US would do in Vietnam, even if they had found a perfect replacement for Diem. They would keep escalating bit by bit until something happened. But they never defined what that something was. Were they going to defeat the communists in the north? If that was the objective, why didn't they take a total war stance before and save thousands of American and millions of Vietnamese lives instead of escalating a little by little? If I had been in the spot they were in early on in Vietnam, I would have left it alone. Containment forced the Kennedy administration to view events like a horse with blinders. They could only see how defeat or loss to communism would affect American prestige. If the Kennedy administration had taken the blinders off and realized that they didn't need to interfere in a war that they had created on the other side of the world, they would have saved millions of lives. I believe it was the direct result of US aid to South Vietnam that resulted in America having such a powerful influence. If the generals believed American aid would have been cut off, they wouldn't have overthrown Diem for some time, if at all. It was the direct result of Kennedy's continuous aid to South Vietnam, and their statement that they would continue it if the generals overthrew Diem that greatly hastened, if not made possible, the coup by the generals. Therefore, I believe that it was the Kennedy administration's support that led to the overthrow and assassination of Diem and Nu.